Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this climate distress workshop. My name is Shamta Hunter. I'm the manager of sustainability student engagement with the Sustainability Hub. I'm also a PhD candidate in the Faculty of Education with a research focus on sustainability curriculum and pedagogy. And I am joined here today by my colleague Megan. Megan, do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, everyone. My name is Megan Wise. I use she, her pronouns, and I'm the coordinator at the Climate Hub at UBC. And as of late, my research focuses and attentions have been drawn heavily into the interconnections between climate change, mental health and well-being, and community resilience building. And so that's part of why I'm here with Shamta today. So looking forward to spending some time with you all and moving through this process together.
So we would like to acknowledge that UBC's Vancouver Point Grey campus is situated on the traditional, ancestral, unceded territory of the Musqueam people. I make this acknowledgement with a deep sense of consideration for the impacts of climate change and related injustices on our Indigenous communities for many, many years. Although this sense of urgency and associated anxiety or distress might be new to some of us, it is not for many Indigenous communities who have been feeling the impacts for generations. We would also like to acknowledge that you are joining us today from many places, near and far, and acknowledge the traditional owners and caretakers of those lands. You may want to acknowledge the lands that you occupy in your chat intros. Feel free to do that and visit native-land.ca to learn more. I'm personally joining you today from the Coast Salish, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh territories here in East Vancouver. So before we start with that acknowledgement, and before we start, I would like to welcome you to join me in a grounding exercise before we dive into the discussions of climate distress. This is called a square or a box breathing exercise and works in 4-second sequences. It is a relaxation technique that calms your mind, improves focus by decreasing stress in your body and by slowing down your breathing. So I'll welcome you to please join me. You may turn off your videos if you like to and close your eyes. Ensure you're sitting upright on your chair, or you may stand or even lie down for this on your back for this exercise. Make sure your back is well supported and your feet is firm on the floor. You can place one hand on your chest and one on your stomach and breathe as you would normally for about 20 seconds. Observe the rise and fall on your chest and stomach. If you notice that your chest is rising but your stomach is not, you're shallow breathing. Try to breathe through your stomach if you can, activating full relaxation in your body. And with that, I'll ask you to try and breathe in through your nose for about 4 seconds. 3, 2, 1. Hold your breath for about 4 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And exhale through your mouth for 4 seconds. 3, 2, 1. And hold again for 4, 3, 2, 1. And let's do that again for about 2 more times. Breathe in through your nose. 3, 2, 1. Hold. 3, 2, 1. Exhale through your mouth. 3, 2, 1. And hold again for 3, 2, 1. Breathe in through your nose. 3, 2, 1. Hold. 3, 2, 1. Exhale. 3, 2, 1. And hold again. 3, 2, 1. And try and relax. You can open your eyes. Thank you for participating in that exercise. Hopefully you're a little bit more relaxed. You can, try and move your neck around if you can. just shake out all the anxiety if we can. Um, and with that, I'll welcome you to join me and Megan in this Jamboard, where we'll welcome you to put your thoughts on, have you experienced ecological or climate grief and anxiety? And if so, how did it represent or manifest itself in your life or work? So the Jamboard link is in the chat. Feel free to, there's a sticky note on the side. Feel free to use those to put in your thoughts. I see sometimes anger, sometimes concern about my children. I can completely empathize with that. Loneliness, general sense of sadness for my kids and future generations. Being confronted with whether or not anything we do is worthwhile, recycling, biking, and driving, etc. Yeah. Afraid about my future, not certain what I can do to help. Absolutely. As a Bangladeshi, my country is one of the most disproportionately vulnerable in the world. I feel almost constant, overwhelming grief, alienation, loss. Yes, loneliness, sadness, anxiety. Absolutely. We agree and empathize with all of these. Feelings of panic, always under the surface and present. Guilt, feeling like headaches. Feeling like a hypocrite to have been travel across the world just to this committed family. Yes. Depression, mourning, helplessness. Yes, absolutely. I hear you. And these are the feelings that we are all feeling, I think, including students on our campus. Thank you so much for sharing that. I would like to flip the narrative here, and in our next slide, if you can think about, what does climate well-being look like to you? What does it look like to you to be climate well? Finding my place, role, and agency in the climate movement. Intact, robust nature. Contributing to restoring community climate justice initiatives. Great. Actively choosing, celebrating, and protecting joy and ease for us, BIPOC. Feeling love and loved, loving the world we are gifted with. Absolutely. This is my first time hearing climate well-being. Please give me a moment to think. Absolutely, yes, yes. Enjoy the fight for a better future. Finding joy in the resistance. Stories of resiliency in the face of climate change. Community well-being, or community being with others working on these issues. Gentleness and gratitude for being, for connection, for interdependence, and loving justice. Great. Spending time in nature and nurturing my human to human and human to animal connections. These are wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing these. Having my children celebrate nature without a feeling of concern, not to worry. Feels like hope that there is more to look forward to than there is to fear. Yeah. feeling held by nature and each other. That's great. Thank you so much for sharing these. These are wonderful. Thank you. I will hand it to Megan now.
Thank you, Shanta. Yeah, really appreciating all of those reflections, just taking time to kind of process that and recognizing that some have been dealing with these issues for a while in some of their work or research or context, and some are coming to these issues and kind of learning different aspects of this as we go. And so recognizing that we're all in different phases of our learning journey. I just want to kind of move into some context and background to ground us in some of the ways that climate is impacting our lives and work and that kind of thing. As I'm sure you're all well aware, climate impacts like heat waves, flooding, forest fires, air pollution, deforestation, biodiversity loss, as well as extreme weather events are disrupting critical community systems. It's increasing individual and community experiences of extreme stress, anxiety, PTSD, depression, feelings of loss and loneliness, as well as confusion and anger, rage, despair, and feelings of helplessness and also hopelessness and solastalgia, amongst many, many, many other feelings and complex kind of emotions. And though we should never normalize the impacts of preventable climate change, it is, however, entirely normal and expected to experience these feelings of fear and anxiety and depression and grief and anger about climate change and the processes and impacts of it. And these mental and emotional responses are not innately pathological or what we would call unhealthy per se, and should actually be understood as valid responses to processing and responding to really difficult climate change issues and experiences that we face. And in many ways, these feelings of, our deep sense of care or love for nature, for our communities, and the spaces that we move around and live in. And we're hurting because we can actually think about this as being grounded in care and love for our spaces, our ecosystems, our communities, and what we're seeing happening to them. So it's this deep connection of care between our humanity and climate change issues as well. So thinking about it from a care-based lens there and how our fear and anxiety stems from that. And then also thinking about validation and acknowledgement of such feelings. And it's really important because acknowledging and processing these feelings can actually help us move through them as opposed to getting stuck in them. And so recognizing that we can validate our own feelings ourselves, and we can also help other people validate their emotions as well. So as we dive into these issues today as educators and folks who work in these spaces to help support other community members, it's important that we start from a specific, looking at specific contexts of how climate change continues to directly, indirectly, and vicariously impact students and communities that we live in and work amongst. For example, there was a research that came out that said 54% of adults and 45% of children suffer depression after a disaster. This was an American-based study, but we do know that this type of impact is happening on a mass scale in response to the many climate-related disasters that we're seeing. So how might this be coming into our teaching and learning spaces? And I think that's a really important thing that we are aware of and are reflecting on. So today I'm just going to touch on a few globally magnifying climate events and processes to highlight a few of the ways that climate change processes are directly intersecting with student mental health and well-being in the here and now, and how that might connect to our learning. So the first one is heat waves. Heat waves are one of the fastest growing climate threats that we face locally and globally for that matter. The growing frequency and magnitude of heat waves continues to generate more experiences of stress, depression, anxiety, exhaustion, experiences of dehydration, heat stroke, fainting, loss of life even, as we have seen in the devastating heat dome that took place that took upwards of 600 lives prematurely due to extreme heat events. And that can be very traumatic for a community and for families. And research has also linked heat waves to higher rates of anger, irritability, violence, community crime, as well as spikes in domestic and gender violence as well when we see heat waves and heat dome events take place. And then in a university context, some impacts might look like decreased sleep, sleep deprivation, feelings of irritability growing and increasing, and decreased capacity to mentally, emotionally, and physically process information and tasks related to schoolwork. We know that we don't function as well when we are stressed by extreme heat, as well as experiences of, again, anxiety, depression, and feelings of being trapped by the heat. As we know, a lot of student housing doesn't have adequate cooling systems. And so there can be those feelings of you can't get away from it. And research has also found that during heat waves, students in dorms and learning spaces that don't have adequate cooling perform worse on cognitive testing and actually see negative impacts on academic achievement and outcomes. So that has a direct relationship to, what we're trying to do when we're aiming for, optimal and successful learning experiences. And so these kinds of impacts can have an impact on student well-being, their sense of competency, and even their sense of self-esteem. Also being conscious that students on particular medications or with pre-existing conditions like diabetes might have trouble regulating body heat. And so that can actually add layers of complexity in learning experiences during extreme heat events. So thinking about that from a disability justice lens as well. And then we also have forest fires. Increasing extreme heat and drought, for example, are causing more frequent forest fires and magnified wildfires, both in BC and globally. And there's well-known links that are being found between forest fire events and increased rates of anxiety, depression, PTSD, distress and bereavement, as well again as domestic violence and community-wide trauma. And research published in The Lancet not that long ago actually found persons living within 50 kilometers of a major wildfire had a 10% higher chance of cancerous brain tumors and a 4.9% increased higher chance of lung cancer than those living further away from a major forest fire event. So thinking about that in a BC context is pretty significant. I know myself personally, I've lived within 50 kilometers of at least 4 major wildfires. So that really did catch my eye. And then thinking about that again from our students in our learning spaces. So as forest fire season, they're calling it season now, forest fire season, which is not necessarily an acceptable way to frame this, but as that comes near, again, we might feel a sense of anxiety or fear that we know this is coming. And so that can be something that students and families are worried about. Research coming out from communities impacted by forest fires, for example, Fort McMurray, found that students who experienced wildfires, evacuations, or had homes or community infrastructure impacted saw higher rates of PTSD. Students saw higher rates of depression, anxiety, substance misuse, as well as higher rates of suicidal thinking and ideation. And then impacted students also presented higher rates of low self-esteem, lower perception of quality of life, and even decreased resilience when they did resilience testing on these students who experienced forest fires. And they also found that students don't have to directly be involved in a forest fire, but they can also experience indirect and vicarious trauma from watching a forest fire take place in another community. So for example, watching Lytton burn the entire town tragically, watching wildfires in Australia, watching the Amazon burn, this can cause vicarious types of trauma or distress in students as well. And of course we have flooding. Like heat waves, flooding is a common climate event on the rise due to more extreme weather patterns, and BC saw an extreme example of this in the devastating floods that we saw in the fall. And also there's already concern growing about a rapid spring snowmelt because it's been such a cool spring. So thinking about how flooding is impacting community is really important as well. So flooding events do correlate with higher levels of anxiety, excessive worry, irritability, fatigue, and difficulty concentrating, and all sorts of other physical ailments as well. And with like with forest fires, the looming threat of this can actually cause some stress in family homes. They're worried about, security. It can cause economic strain on families as well who've experienced a flooding event. And knowing flooding might come could actually trigger past experiences of flooding trauma as well. And then there's also this dynamic of sea level rise and, these ideas of planned retreat or managed retreat, and also ideas of losing spaces, community spaces and natural landscapes that we love, and this idea of solastalgia, which is a deep grief of loss of space in your environment around you that you feel connected to. And then we have air pollution, which I find is a very interesting one. I don't think get enough attention, but it's actually a significant community harm when it comes to thinking about climate change. Air pollution, particularly fossil fuel emissions, is a rapid and urgent growing community health and well-being issue. So recent study from the Lancet found that upwards of 1 in 6 global deaths is attributable to air pollution. And I think that's a really significant number when we think about the impact on community that has. And some relationships there with students, for example. So we know that fossil fuel emissions are causing all sorts of community disease and distress. That can be fossil fuels, that can be dust related, that can be pollen related, but there's a whole bunch of issues there that connect to our health and how that impacts our mental health and well-being, for example. And also, certain emissions chemicals like nitrogen oxide pollution from fossil fuel burning has been found to be generating about 4 million youth cases of asthma annually. So these are our future students who are coming into our spaces with compromised health because of climate-related issues. And then also air pollution can weaken the immune system. So again, when we're thinking about folks showing up to school, folks showing up to work, feeling good in a space to learn, air pollution is compromising health and the ability to fight off sickness and disease, which also when we think about climate change and the increased projection of pandemics and illness, for example, that creates a complicated layer there for understanding how we can navigate our spaces in relationship to these issues. And then also students might kind of face air shelter-in-place warnings. So for example, when we see a forest fire and there are weeks of smoke pollution in the air, folks are advised not to go outside into the outdoor spaces so that they avoid toxic smoke pollution from forest fires. And this can cause a disconnect from community or senses of isolation as well. And so I also want to just touch on quickly how it's important to remember that UBC is a network of international students with home communities in other parts of the world. So students who we might be working with, BC might be fine temporarily at the moment, but these students might have extreme events taking place back in home communities that is causing distress and anxiety because of what's happening back in their home community. So keeping that in mind as well is important for how we're navigating these issues as well in a global context to local context. And then also situating these issues as an interconnected framework, thinking about the pandemic, wealth inequity, food system security, and things like that, systems of racism, white supremacy, and how those are informing some of these issues that we're thinking about and talking about as well when we're talking about climate change, climate anxiety, and also pathways to action. So I think what we're going to do is we are going to move into, so that kind of gives us a foundation of some of the context of how some of these issues might be impacting the students or the staff or the community members that we're working with. And so thinking about that context, and then how are we seeing that in the work that we do, or are we conscious of it in the work that we do? So we're going to move into a breakout room. We're going to break everybody up. We'll go into the room for about 8 minutes. And we'll have a prompt for you as well. What we're going to do is we're going to use the same Jamboard link that we used just a moment ago. And if you toggle to the side, it's broken up into group numbers. So if you're in group 1, go to your first slide. It'll say group 1, task 1 or breakout room 1. And that will be your Jamboard for this breakout discussion. And then if you're group 2, go to just keep toggling to the right and you'll find your number of your group that you're in. And then this is the discussion also that the discussion prompt that you'll also see on the Jamboard. And it's how do you see climate change events and emotions impacting how you navigate your teaching and student engagements? So again, getting us to start thinking about how we're thinking about climate change in relationship to the experiences that our students are having and experiences that we are having as well. And I think Eliza is going to put us into breakout rooms, if that's all right.
Well, welcome back, everyone. We wanted to hear from people about what they shared, what if something jumped out at you in your own group conversations. Please feel free to unmute and share if you would like to.
Yeah, in my group, we had a chance to reflect. It was a very interesting dynamic because I'm a student and I was in a group with a lovely professor of biology. And it was really interesting to see this shared sense of like a collective exhaustion, you know, in being in academic spaces where the climate change is often intellectualized and treated as though it's like a very distant reality and not grounded in immediate lived experiences here and now. And, you know, I'm from Bangladesh. And so this intersects so intimately with not just like my professional interests, but also, you know, my immediate futures. So we also talked a lot about, you know, while it is very exhausting and draining to be in spaces, you know, having to like ground realities of climate change, particularly, you know, in an institution characterized by a lot of inaction, such as UBC. We also connected on collectively feeling that anger as a catalyst for, you know, coming together and you know, engaging in civil disobedience. So while there is that sense of you know, very collective loss and fatigue, there's also almost like a spiteful care and love that is very energizing. So, yeah.
I love that framing of spiteful care and love. We'll talk in a second about a term that we call messy hope. And it is that kind of like remembering that in this complexity, there is that care, that joy, that hope, that, you know, collectiveness that is so critical and important. Yeah. Thank you for those reflections. And again, really highlighting the immediacy of this. This is now, many communities have been living through this for a long time. And so this is past, present, and very much ongoing. So really appreciate those reflections. Thank you. If anyone else wants to, also feel free to use the chat. If folks feel more comfortable adding their reflections to the chat or something that really caught your ear or eye or heart or mind, you know, please add that and share that as well, because it's helpful for other folks to see what's landing with other people, and it helps to normalize the many, many different ways that we can kind of think about this and explore this and navigate this. So the vulnerability to share is very welcome and very appreciated. So feel free to use that chat function as well. And Shamta, I'll turn it over to you to kind of move into some of the terminology of what we've been talking about. We've been using this term anxiety or climate anxiety. So kind of checking in on what we mean by that and exploring that a bit more.
Yes, absolutely. We thought we wanted to share and kind of differentiate some of the terms that are often used interchangeably, specifically climate anxiety and climate grief, as well as some of the associated terms. Here are three sort of distinct definitions of climate anxiety from various sources. You'll see this chronic fear of environmental doom. It is also defined as mental distress or anxiety associated with worsening or environmental conditions, and anxiety experienced in response to past, current, and anticipated ecological crisis. It is important to note that research highlights one of the main causes of climate-related distress or anxiety in youth has been the anticipation of climate events or pre-traumatic stress. Emotions related to climate change are not all about climate change, but about how an idea of climate change threatens objects of care. Climate change can materialize fear and anxieties. And in terms of climate grief, the grief felt in relation to experience or anticipated ecological losses, including the loss of species, ecosystems, and meaningful landscapes due to acute or chronic environmental change. This grief is not only associated with the direct loss of nature, such as the clear cutting of a rainforest or extinction of a species, it can also arise in response to changes in the way of our life, the way we live. Consolo and Ellis identified three pathways through which ecological grief can manifest. Grief associated with physical ecological losses and attendant ways of life and culture, grief associated with disruption to environmental knowledge systems and resulting feeling of loss of identity as a relation to that, and grief associated with anticipated future loss of place, land, species, and culture. So ecological grief can be about an environmental change on the physical level, but it can also be about loss of knowledge, culture, identity, and as they relate to a particular place or to the state of the planet as a whole. when we feel ecological grief in response to the impacts and anticipated impacts of climate disruption, including fears of despair, anger, fear, guilt, sadness, yearning, disorganization, and other emotions, we call that climate grief. In the next slide, we have assembled some other associated terms that you may have heard about. Eco-denial, which is the blocking bad environmental news. Eco-dissociation, which is the disconnection of being a part of the natural system. Eco-rage, which is the anger that is associated with and the frustration that comes with it. And eco and climate trauma, the severe environmental experiences that become traumatic. And solastalgia, which is the pain or distress caused by the loss of a comforting place. So these are all very much used, and there's still a bit of a not necessarily a combined kind of definition that we use, and most of these terms are used very interchangeably. So in this sense, how do we make space to talk about climate change? And I'll pass it to Megan to talk about that.
Thanks, Shramta. Yeah, making space, as we're doing today, to talk about climate issues is something that we can all do in our work and in our life and take part in as climate action. And it's critical that we make time and space to acknowledge and again, process how experiencing and learning about and reflecting on the facts and realities of climate change can be emotionally difficult, traumatic, and overwhelming. And so, you know, thinking about, and again, this isn't just kind of this random idea. Research is actually finding that carving out space and making intentional space is helpful for not just youth and students, but everybody to navigate different dynamics and feelings of climate fears, anxieties, and all of these different emotions and kind of feelings that we've been talking about and exploring today. And so it can actually really, you know, making these spaces can help connect community to each other, to actions. It can help us feel a stronger sense of agency and a stronger sense of hope in navigating these issues as a collective and as a community, as opposed to individuals feeling isolated and, you know, marred in forms of climate anxiety and grief. And so thinking as, you know, educators and again, folks who work in these issues and how we might make that space to talk about climate change. So I'm just going to run through some tips here that we've used at the Climate Hub, but also I found a really lovely graphic that had been developed by Climate Talk. And it's specifically targeting youth and students about different ways that we can make space, meaningful space to talk about climate change. So again, being clear and explicit that complex feelings stemming from climate change can be a normal and rational response, that that's not unhealthy or abnormal in any kind of way, and empowering students to envision more just, equitable, healthy systems and communities. Use that power of imagination and tap into that to remind students and youth and community that humans built these systems that we have. We built them and we can rebuild them. And that can be very encouraging to remind students of that reality. Teach and model healthy ways to respond to difficult facts about climate change. We are modeling how we can support students in this. Hey, I feel sad about this. That's okay to say that to students. But I feel sad about it, which motivated me to connect to my community to take this action. That's showing a healthy kind of modeling way of acknowledging, moving through, and a pathway to action. Be respectful and supportive of different stages of understanding. Again, we're all in a different phase of our learning journey. Don't deny or reject someone's climate feelings. They are valid. Acknowledge them, get curious about them, ask about them, explore them with each other, and use harm reduction approaches and pair difficult facts, again, with solution-based thinking that builds agency, builds imagination and conversation on these complex issues. And tell the truth and highlight the root causes of climate change, the core ones that are really need some leverage attention on them. For example, the role of fossil fuels in emissions magnification, the role of gender inequity, colonization, roles of white supremacy, and how these issues connect to the way systems work and could be targeted for solutions. And then also use art and nature and music and poetry and dance, and again, tap into that imagination as different mediums to explore climate feelings and issues, to help move from data and reports and move that into the hearts and minds and imaginations of students, bring it alive in those kinds of ways. And then build trust. Talking about mental health and well-being impacts of climate change does require some dedicated trust building to open up welcoming, vulnerable space where people feel like they can share those feelings and emotions. And then I also just want to quickly touch on this idea, this concept of messy hope is what we call it. I've been calling it messy hope for the last couple of years, and then I saw that there's a book coming out called Messy Hope, and it is about climate change. So I haven't read it yet, but I'm really looking forward to it because I'm wondering if those concepts align. But before I just dig into what I mean by this or kind of want to say about this, I do want to invite everybody here to just add in the chat one small or big, micro to macro, doesn't matter, one small thing that gives you hope when you think about climate change. I know that can seem counterintuitive, but I think that's really important, that we take a minute to share those nuggets of hope, to show each other that we do have them, that they do exist, that we can maybe coalesce or come together around one of those moments of hope together. So I invite you all to just kind of drop in the chat something that gives you hope when you think about climate change. And somebody's just added events and spaces like these. Yes, thank you. These spaces lift my heart. I can't even tell you how much I just appreciate and value folks that come into these spaces and are willing to share. Mushrooms. Yeah, shout out for mushrooms and some climate hope there. Yes. How much love we are all capable of. Yes, love for one another and the world, the existence of love. Beautiful. Yeah, and so there, we've got some hope already to ground us when we're thinking about these things. And so thinking about this idea of hope, as we work with students and our community networks and even ourselves, it's important to remember that we should not be looking to replace our climate anxiety or grief with just hope and optimism. These are not binary or zero-sum emotions or feelings, and they're fundamentally co-informing and coexisting. And that's important that we recognize that. We're not just trying to get rid of climate anxiety, because that can actually play a role in motivating us to take action, but remembering that we also have these room and spaces for complicated joy and messy hope. And I want to talk also about this. The reason that we talk about hope is because it's really important to work to reframe climate narratives of doom and gloom and defeatism into ones of more nuanced and targeted engagements of collaboration, of care, of deep care, and solution-based thinking for effective action. And breaking climate change down from a monolith, just saying climate change or climate crisis, as somebody had said, breaking that down into its tangible parts and pieces that we can connect solutions to. It helps to build agency for folks to recognize where they can target in or where a pathway to action might lie. And using this hope lens to reframe climate change from abstract into tangible is really important, because climate messaging has been found that when it's used through narratives of hope and optimism and engagement and collaboration, it actually motivates people to take more action and more investment in climate action if it's framed in a hopeful lens, as opposed to doom and gloom narratives, which can actually tend to turn people away or push them into denialism or rejection type mentalities, like I just don't have time for that, I don't have emotional space for that. So using that lens to really build encouraging space to draw people into action. And it's also just a more sustainable pathway forward for us as individuals and human beings to work with each other in a hopeful solution-based thinking lens. So I'm going to hand it back to Shanta for a minute as we go into looking at some of these particular lenses that we've been talking about. We've been talking about resilience, we've been talking about trauma. And so Shanta's going to kind of walk us through some more specific nuances of these lenses and how that might be brought into a teaching practice or community teaching practice.
Thank you, Megan. But before I get into that, we want to model what we are saying. So I would welcome you again to a grounding exercise with me. And this is one that I've often used in my own practice with students. This is a somatic exercise, which is also one of the resilience building strategies that we will talk about in a bit. It is a mindful exercise to notice what you are experiencing right now through any or all of your five senses: sound, sight, touch, taste, and smell. Your senses are real. They connect you with your world. So let's trust them. So it is also referred to as 5, 4, 3, 2, 1 for the five senses. So I'll welcome you to join me here. You will need your sight. So you'll need your eyes open for the first one. So I would like you to just take a moment and look around. Look around for five things that you can see. Look for small details such as patterns on the ceilings, the way light reflects off a surface, or an object that you may have never noticed before around you. So I'll give you 5 seconds to do that. 5 things. And now you can close your eyes once you have done that and notice those 5 things that you may not notice every day. You can close your eyes and feel. Use your sense of touch. Touch, sensation of clothing on your body, or feeling of the chair you're sitting on. You may pick up an object and examine its weights, its texture, other physical qualities. Feel the textures around you. It's just 4 things, 4 different textures that you can feel. Even your skin or hair. Okay, keeping with your eyes closed, and for this one you definitely need your eyes closed because you're trying to isolate your sense of hearing. So 3 things that you can hear. Pay attention, special attention to the sounds your mind has tuned out, such as the ticking of the clock or distant traffic or trees or just wind blowing. The second thing, 2 things that you can smell. Notice the smell in the air around you, the smell of freshly mowed grass, perhaps. And lastly, taste. What is that one thing you can taste in your mouth? If you can even take a drink of water or coffee or tea and focus on the flavors. All right, you may open your eyes. Thank you for joining me. How's everyone feeling about that? How was those 5 senses? I mean, we usually don't even think about those because we use them so often together. Any thoughts? Thumbs up. Okay, great, great. Okay, so with that, let's step into talking about how to engage and support students through trauma-informed lens. And I want to focus here on 3 main aspects of trauma-informed lens here. The first one is relationship and connectivity and warmth, transparency and predictability, and empowerment, reflexivity. And we'll talk about that in the next slides. Thank you. So one, of course, one of the frameworks that I often use in my own practice is the pedagogy of kindness. And all of these really reflect well in that. If you're interested, I can include more information about that framework. The focus on compassion, getting to know your students, show you care, actually verbalizing that, because we often verbalize the critiques. We don't often verbalize the positive aspects of what students bring. Think through their lessons and anticipate what would there be any triggers, and thinking about that in advance and providing that warning if needed. Being open-minded and empathize with the judgment, without judgment and our threats. Affirming responses by reflecting back using students' language and their words, often in the discussion, really brings in that empathy piece as well. If you feel like the discussion is becoming unproductive, pause, take a pause, and do one of those grounding exercises to kind of bring the group together. Thank the students for a discussion, like how often we actually thank our students for participating in our classrooms. So a lot of these kind of build upon each other, and it just creates that culture of kindness within the classroom so that everybody is supporting everyone. And as an instructor, you're not the only one who everybody's looking up to. So it's kind of creating that learning community. The second one is transparency and predictability. And this is where using consistent routines, being clear and transparent about expectations, using multiple modes of communication to reach to students and ensure that they're receiving current and updated information. Giving students materials ahead of time so that they expect what's to come, and informing students of the structure of the facilitation. So what should they be expecting? What's your role in the classroom? Are you a facilitator? Are you an expert? I often come out as more of a facilitator because I don't think I'm an expert in anything. So I often introduce myself as I'm a facilitator of conversations and discussions in this space. And the third one is empowerment and reflexivity. And sorry, the next slide, Megan. There you go. Encouraging voicing through emotions, offering students collaboration choices, and even having students being partners in creation of that course and curriculum, or the assessment strategy that you're using, bringing them into that conversation and kind of encouraging them to really understand where you're coming from and some of the assessment pieces that they feel like are more fair. Explore co-designing assignments or criterias, discussing current events and care and emotional reflexivity. And I'll talk about emotional reflexivity in a bit. Making connection to societal issues and course curriculum and how that connects to your course, because everything connects to what's happening in our environments. So how can we make those connections within our course? Yes, and we wanted to talk a little bit about mobilizing as practitioners, but I wanted to just say one thing, that links have increasingly been made between pre-traumatic stress caused by knowledge of climate change in the Western world. Most of the studies on climate anxiety have been primarily in the Western world, not necessarily in other places, which can trigger past personal, cultural, and generational traumas. This rethinking of scale and interconnectedness of trauma associated with climate change requires that place, culture, context, and histories are often taken into consideration when you're using the trauma-informed lens. And in terms of emotional reflexivity, which is to examine one's own feeling, assumptions, etc., and how they might be impacting their behavior, acknowledges that emotions can move, change, transform, and can be transformative when they have the space and safety to do so. So offering that space, acknowledging that emotions are part of our lives, they are normal. It's normal to feel climate anxiety, and how do you move past that realization? So in terms of mobilizing as practitioners, gathering information and resources about climate and trauma impacts, building that culture within your departments, and finding those other champions who can work with you. It's often very supportive systems in terms of just offering that support to instructors. Creating spaces to process and connect with others, and communicating climate change issues within your classrooms and outside, finding ways to link and embed strategies through your current practice. And I wanted to move a bit into resilience piece here. We wanted to talk about, and Megan has touched on these a little bit. And there are four kind of areas in terms of resiliency building. And Megan talked about trust, and kind curiosity is the first one. And really trusting, like again, that trusting that the feeling of climate grief is normal, allowing them to manifest and not trying to fight them, cultivating that really cultivates that inner resilience and builds that core emotional strength. Somatic awareness, we did a couple of exercises today. This really means tracking how grief is experienced in our bodies, because it's not just a mental grief, it's a physical grief as well. More and more research shows that thoughts and feelings are experienced in the body through tension in our shoulders, in tightness in our throat, or dread in our belly, or anxious agitation in our hands and feet. Being aware of that particular somatic response that you feel and learning ways to self-soothe them physiologically can help us cope with feelings without being overwhelmed. And the third one is knowing the story. And this is...
Sorry, I don't mean to interrupt you. Do you want me to going through the slides? I apologize. I don't know if you want me on the first slide or if you want me going through each of the slides as you talk.
Yes, go through the slides. Sorry.
Yeah, my apologies. Yeah.
No worries. Yeah, so I'm at the knowing the story. There you go. Understanding the facts around climate change, and learn the successful stories, the solution-oriented stories, and really bringing that into your classroom in terms of how can we think about through solutions thinking approach, and kind of really using those grounding activities to again bring those notions together. And the last one is creative expression. And again, Megan talked about this. And climate anxiety can also be addressed through increasing connection with the relationship with your local community, being actively engaged and increasing agency, leveraging the human creativity to shift our focus from the question of what we have done, which is more of a backward looking, uncreative perspective, to the creative question of what can we do. And this is where most of the creative expressions come through. And with that, I would like to acknowledge that all these amazing creative drawings that you see in our slides is all Megan, so I want to credit her for that. So with that, I see a lot of action in the chat. I don't know if there are any questions there, but we can also move into our last group discussion.
Shamta, there are two comments about wanting to hear more about the kindness framework.
Yes. So I didn't talk more about that, but I can definitely share more information. And with the pedagogy of kindness, there's really two kind of main principles that dictate that. And one is believing students, and the other one is believing in students. And it really captures a lot of what we talked about today. Believing students is when a student comes to you and says, I couldn't do my assignment because. Believe them. Trust in them and say, yes, I believe you. Dog ate my homework. I believe you. And believing in students is that they have the capacities and ability to really navigate and inform their own learning, and kind of bringing them into that process and believing in their capacities to do so. So believing students and believing in students. There's a whole comparison between, so pedagogy of care has been very popular in the past years, but now more pedagogy of kindness has been more emerging, kind of building on that framework. But there are a lot of differences between the two. Pedagogy of care requires a lot of one-on-one support because that's how care happens. Whereas pedagogy of kindness is something that you can bring into your large classrooms. And it's, again, kind of building that structure, building that community agreement of sorts within your classroom. I'm happy to share that with you. There's lots on that kindness pedagogy, and I can share that with you in the resources.
Shanta, I'm just wondering, because we're a smaller group, instead of doing a breakout room, should we actually just do one big room where we navigate
Yes.
the board together? Okay, let's do that.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm going to put the Jamboard link in the chat again. It's the same Jamboard. So if you already have that link open, just toggle back to that link for yourself. But yeah, we were going to go into smaller breakout rooms, but I think we have a great number of folks here right now where we can navigate this together on one of the Jamboard slides, and just, again, invite folks to add to the Jamboard, but also, you know, open up to discussion where you can kind of unmute yourselves and have actual conversation.
I would love to hear from people, actually. Yes.
Yeah. So I've got this Jamboard up, and I'll keep it shared screen. But as you can see on the bottom, there's a couple of prompts. That's to guide, but you know, if there's other questions that lay outside of the prompts that we have here, you know, also feel free to explore those. And then, yeah, just feel free to add to this one here. So the first prompt that we can kind of start with, how do you see yourself engaging strategies outlined in this session in your teaching practices? And, you know, one of the ways we think about teaching is, yes, there's, you know, faculty student dynamics at UBC, but there's also a lot of staff student teaching dynamics at UBC. And then there's also a lot of folks who are educators in the work they do, and community, and wider community, and broader community as well. So there's a lot of different levels and networks and kind of layers of what we mean by teaching and educating. So however that question lands for you and your context is what really matters, and that can look different for everybody. And so I see some here, being especially international in how I phrase and frame reflective exercises. Yes, sorry, intentional. Yes, intentional and international potentially. Yes, and how a phrase and frame reflective exercises. I think that's really important. Language matters. So the framing that we use, the metaphors that we use really do matter. And that does help frame the way that we think about solutions. It helps frame the way we think about our own emotions. So really appreciate that mindfulness in that process that you're doing. Some continued emphasis on normalizing these hard feelings. Yes, that may be coming up, and affirming them, encouraging the processes of these emotions as a group. Yeah, these are challenging emotions. And so preparing ourselves by processes like this, where we have some knowledge that we can build from, we have some resources that we can draw from, not that we have all the answers and we don't need to, but just opening that space up to feel, to be human with each other, be vulnerable with each other, and find some solidarity in those feelings and emotions, and sense of care for each other. Offering more transparency about emotional realities, holding space for folks through active listening, gentle reflection, and compassionate pace and language. Yeah, I love that gentle reflection. I love the gentleness. I just love that somebody added this idea of gentleness in there. So I really appreciate that. And if anyone wants to expand on that, please jump in.
I would also add that, you know, we don't have to be experts in climate change in order to talk about climate change. We are experiencing it every day, the anxiety associated with it, or anything. So we are part of it. So we don't have to be experts in it to talk about it. I think we should be talking about it all the time and connecting it with the work that we are doing. So, you know, yes, of course, it'll be helpful to know some facts and figures, but I really don't think students are expecting you to be experts in this, because we are all learning as we go.
Yeah, that's a great point, because sometimes it stops us, right? That, you know, the paralysis of thinking we don't know enough yet. But when it comes to an emergency situation like climate change, we know enough about our own feelings to talk about them. And that's always important to remember. So, you know, these are really lovely. And again, we will share this back to the group, because there's a lot here that we can learn from. And again, sharing is so important because it lets us recognize and acknowledge how other people are processing these issues and how they're framing them, how they might be connecting to strategies for action in their practices, and that might trigger something for us to kind of think about and how we deal with our own practices. So this networking and this strategy sharing is so important to keep building that collaborative network of action and support for each other. Just trying to find room for all these amazing. And also, if you want, you can go to the slide next door as well and keep adding. But I do want to offer open space for folks to jump in and kind of share, practices or questions, reflections that they think would be helpful to explore as a group here today as well.
Shamta and Megan, I'm just going to jump in. This is Tara. It might be helpful if you actually took the slide down so that people, it's maybe intimidating to say stuff when you're speaking in this framework. Yeah, I think that's easier. Thank you.
That's a good point. Thank you, Tara. Yes, Sagarika, you wanted to? Yes.
Yeah, I kind of wanted to expand on two things, and like thinking of gentleness as like a systemic intervention. In my experience, living with mental illness as an international student throughout like my degree thus far, I have noticed not just among myself, but there is a very immense collective fatigue, that, and especially because I'm in like the social sciences, and there is often a lot of burnout. And I think, living under neoliberal capitalism, that's something that's very, normalized, expected. So thinking about the rates of success, like academic success that I've had, but also, my peers have had, they have always been in classes that have been flexible and compassionate in their timelines, in, deadlines, in, with assignments, and just knowing that you're in a space where not only, are you encouraged to learn, but also unlearn. And I think that, I wouldn't be like, I won't mince words. Like, I don't think I would be here now if it weren't for the kindness of professors who held that space for me, who were able to, center compassion in their practice. And it wasn't just like, oh, if you need an extension, let me know. It's more like, this is here. These supports are here for you. And it is not just all right if you need them, but, it's expected. And so I think, that kind of gentleness, it can look like having more compassionate timelines, but sometimes it can look also like just creating that environment, emphasizing that this is an environment where, we are all tired together, and there can be ways to continue to hold each other. And that can look like more flexibility, that can look like having more grounding exercises, and as well as, I think adapting to student needs, which is something that unfortunately, I haven't seen so much of as well. So yeah, just thinking of gentleness, because so much is taught to us in such violent ways as well. And this idea of like, what if we were soft with one another instead? What possibilities could that open up? What kind of meaningful work would we be able to do if we weren't so tired all the time? Yeah, just thoughts I've had. Sorry, that was a lot.
No, that was very well said. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I'm like really happy to learn that your experiences with a lot of faculty members has been great, like, with kindness and everything. So I think that's amazing. But yes, you're right. Those systemic realities still exist. We are still in a very much colonized kind of mindset framework. So I think it's important to recognize that, and how do we move past that with that gentle framework. Thank you for sharing that.
And I just want to build on that, and also invite folks to keep jumping in with reflections and questions as well. But again, going back to this reframing, it's so important that we're so conscious and hyper conscious of how we frame the ways we're engaging with climate change. Thinking about, one of the areas of the work that I've done is thinking about climate metaphors. And climate is often put in, for example, a war metaphor. We use a lot of war metaphors to talk about climate change, fighting climate change, the war against climate, a good climate war. War is fundamentally unjust. And so going back to this idea of framing climate change and climate action as understandings of love and understandings of kindness, and how we can use our understanding of love and kindness to demand systems change that fill those demands for love and kindness, instead of these frameworks or metaphors that ask for more harsh, violent, stringent, unjust kind of ideas that go with climate change to tackle the problem, because that might not be the trajectory that we're trying to go. So I'm so fascinated by how you use this gentleness language and this love and collective care framework that is so important. Yeah.
On the flip side, I would also add that this is such a tremendous opportunity for us to change the way we do things. So yes, we are in a crisis. We actually are in an existential crisis, but we have an opportunity to really shift things, really change our paradigms, and think about how can we do things differently. So in a lot of sense, like if we weren't in this mess, we weren't even thinking about changing our framework. So in that sense, I'm really hopeful that this is a great opportunity for us, like COVID-19 was, to change the patterns, change some of the ways we do things, because they haven't been working for a majority of the people. So
I want to quickly note, just so folks are aware how the Jamboard works, most might be familiar. I want to reiterate that it's anonymous, so that, again, that is really important for us thinking about creating vulnerable space for people to share. We use Jamboard because it's anonymous. And so we don't know who is posting what. And so I think that's important to think about when we're asking folks to be vulnerable with their climate emotions, that it can be unsettling to being asked to put your emotions right up on there on a big screen. Tara, as you were kind of saying, like, that can be unsettling, and maybe not feed into this idea of building trust and vulnerability and that kind of thing. So just want to remind folks that we're aiming to have anonymous space for people to share in ways that feel safe and comfortable for them as well.
Unless you log into your Google account, which I have done. Don't log in when you join the Jamboard.
And I want to ask folks here, again, everyone is in their own fields doing their own kind of work with their own dynamics, but have you had experiences where students come to you asking about support for their climate well-being, and well-being meaning they need some mental health support for issues of climate change. They're feeling overwhelmed by issues of climate change. Have people had students come specifically seek them out for support?
Yes, I could throw in there. So this is an interesting. I appreciate the opportunity to be here with you today, because it's kind of cool to be thinking about something and changing something that I've been teaching and engaging with for so long. So, I've been teaching climate change classes for, more than 10 years here on campus. And the need to adjust my teaching over time is just more and more obvious to me, right? So it used to be that it felt quite comfortable to me to be teaching it objectively. Here we are talking about climate change, and we're going to talk about Earth sensitivity and what would happen if we throw this much CO2 in the atmosphere, and what would happen if we throw this so much CO2, and all the stuff that goes with it. And it's much more evident now that I can't do that, right? That I have to engage in other types of conversations, and it's weird as a teaching science to do that. So that's something that's just helpful to think through, right? This bringing in emotions and non-objective kind of perspective into the classroom, when there's this concept in science classes that we really we're teaching the science of something. So that's interesting. But more and more, I would say students are just demanding it. So yes, they're coming, they're asking for that space in the classroom. The undergraduates are coming in teams to my office. suggesting ways that we can change classes. So because as I'm director of this entire program, so they're coming not only to talk about my class, but hey, we've been thinking about the way that we do environmental science, and which, you know, and we really appreciate these kinds of things, but we would like to see more of this coming into it as well. So it's interesting how the students are wanting to have or knowing, identifying and seeing what they need to be able to study this well, and what their peers need to be able to study this well. And it's great that they feel supported to come in and talk about that.
And that's the key point, right? Like how they feel supported. They feel like they can come to you and express what they feel like. And I think that's the point of this. Like, how can we make those safe spaces for folks? So in my own experience and within the Sustainability Ambassadors program, I've had many, many emotional meetings where, you know, we will all be crying by the end of the meeting. But that's the context, because we talk a lot about what's happening and where we are at, and students feel safe enough to express their emotions. But it's when I first started seeing this about, let's say, I think it was probably 6 years ago, and a student will come in to a meeting crying, expressing their emotions and not knowing what to do because they were feeling this crisis. I wasn't ready to support them. I didn't know what to do, and then I'll, like, you know, of course we will talk, and it's just the listening, right? It's just, you're there to listen and support, and you don't have to be an expert, you don't have to be a counselor, you don't have to be a therapist in order to support your students. So I think that's the bottom line. Like, again, you don't have to be an expert in climate change or supporting your students in order to support them. And just being there for them, it's the biggest thing, I think.
Yeah, and to build on that, great points, Tara. Really appreciate you sharing how that's coming into your classroom and how students are physically, literally coming into your classroom. And, you know, seeing in the chat here, love to hear students self-advocating for their needs. And again, students do know what they need. They're seeing these gaps in their climate experiences, and how are they needing to fill them. And so that goes back to kind of some of the points that Shanta brought up, is believe students, first of all, and then how do we support that and listen, Tara, which is what you're doing, right? How do we kind of hear that and then move with that somehow? And then Judy, to your point too, self-directed seminars. So yeah, students are kind of using some of the self-directed seminar structure to fill some of that climate need that they're seeing. And so I know a couple of students that work closely with the Climate Hub did a student seminar a year and a half ago. They went really, really well. And I think, Tara, if I'm not mistaken, or Shanta, I'm not mistaken, that structure is being looked at again for different climate-focused student engagements as well. So love that you're making that connection as well there. Yeah. I do also want to flag, UBC counseling has expanded into thinking about how they can support students specifically for climate well-being and climate change and mental health impacts. And so there are a couple of UBC dedicated staff or counseling staff who are focusing on how to support students specifically with climate focused issues. And so if you ever, you know, come across students that are maybe needing that more focused support, like Shanta said, you don't need to be an expert to care and to listen and offer maybe some strategies or resources to folks that we can support with as well. But there are specific UBC counseling services that you can also connect with if needed as well. Yeah. Tara, I see your hand there.
Yeah, I'll just throw that out because I'll shout out to you guys. I don't know if you're going to do it, but the Climate Hub, the Climate Hub also does excellent work throughout the year, including the climate cafes that Jackie has been involved in. So there's opportunities for students to come together and be supported in talking about these things. So not only inside our classrooms, but in casual, non-challenging spaces outside of the classroom, and then with counseling. So the Climate Hub is another place to look to if your students are interested in stuff, and maybe you could just share those in your classrooms.
Yeah, and I'm happy to connect with some resources too. Because yes, thank you, Tara, for highlighting that we do have opportunities for students to build climate community, and come together and kind of have a collective sense of navigating challenges together, and also strategies and pathways to action. Right? How do we leverage this? These different complex emotions and turning them into connection points for community and community building and yeah, different actions. And so we've got some climate wellbeing resources too that address different things, and address climate anxiety, different coping strategies, understanding connections between different climate issues and how they impact mental health and well-being as well. And sometimes that can be helpful for students. They're just really easy language, accessible, and ways that we can just kind of offer students supports when we might not have the answers ourselves, and we can admit that and say that, and that's okay to say I'm not sure, but I can offer some connection to other resources, and that can be a starting point for us to keep learning together. That would be a great way to support a student, for example. Yeah. I'm mindful of time. We're right at 2:30, and I know folks have very busy lives, and probably we spend way too much time on Zoom, I'm sure. But Shamta, I'll pass it over to you in a second, but I just want to extend my deepest thanks to all of you who came today, and shared this time today. I value it so much. I value your feedback so much, because it's really, really important that we see each other share these feelings, share our reflections and different strategies. It's so powerful for the work that we're all doing. So my deepest thanks to all of you today. And Shamta, thank you for going through this process. And Eliza, thank you for organizing breakout rooms and helping facilitate this as well.
Yeah, I agree, echo everything what Megan just said. Thank you so much for joining. And I would say that some of this conversation could be very draining. I mean, it is for me. So I'm hoping that you can take some time, drink some water, and just breathe, or even go out for a short walk. But thank you so much for joining us and sharing.